Chapter 7. Spurious Results. I tentatively opened the door of the grand foyer of the Ministry of Apothecary and handed the Gamma node my pseudo-elixir prescription form. He examined it with a reserved curiosity. Then he looked up at me and smiled. An expected expression by the utopian state statistical scanners, yet the smile was more an enigmatic, intangible expression, as if he seemed to know of my bluff. For once in my life I was cheating, handing an altered slip, one that was false but for a good cause, a moral crusade, yet a spurious data variable. It was the chain reaction of the stochastic routines that I have exhibited since I left the park, after my unexpected interactions with the barely tangible error nodes. Even beta nodes of the Ministry of Inferences, he said. I tried to maintain my bluff and protect myself from embarrassment. "What do you mean?" I replied. He looked at me knowingly. "Anyway, there you go," he said, as he pointed the scanner away, saying, "We all spin the rules sometimes." "You can turn off the scanner," I said. "We have to clean it," he said, smiling. "I thought they could never be switched off," I replied, shocked. "Well, senior Gamma management are allowed to service the scanners if need be. A malfunctioning scanner could possibly present a fire hazard," he said, winking. "You know I am a beta civil servant," I replied ominously. "You won't say anything, not with your special prescription," the Gamma said, winking. I knew well of the endogenous sigma-delta nodes, but these Gamma nodes were a bit of a mystery to me. They were not as high as a civil servant beta node, or the highest ranking caste of the alpha node. Yet they were much higher and elusive than the common delta and epsilon endogenous sigma nodes that made up the majority of the 1.96 standard deviation of the endogenous sigma caste specific confidence interval of the utopian society. These Gamma node professionals considered themselves upper middle class, even when the middle class system had been replaced with the great utopian sigma caste system. Yet these Gamma seemed so confident within themselves, not necessarily within their confidence interval quota compliance, such as with the simple common delta and epsilon nodes. It seems now I have been suspected of corruption. All fear and respect of my slightly superior beta node position was lost. "We all cheat," he said, pausing, "and lie," which he said with a smile, confident his facial recognition expectations did not fall outside the confidence interval as the scanner was pointed away from its prying observance. I tried to rebut the comment, but his gaze stared into my eyes, which glimmered with a newly found naivety, created by this situation where I was vulnerable due to the willful, dishonest transgression of the rules, all to help the error node, unbiased binary. "It's for a good cause," I replied honestly, yet tacitly admitting my guilt and trying to rationalize a defense. The Gamma apothecary looked at me and said, "I am sure. You don't look the type. Too honest, too rigid, too submissive to the system." Another Gamma node, the apothecary's assistant, appeared behind the counter. "Switch this, will you?" He then looked apprehensive at my presence. "Oh, don't worry about him. He's one of us now," said the biased Gamma apothecary, almost laughing, enjoying my newfound position as a fellow corrupt node. "Switch this to the p-value of 6 so it passes," said the apothecary's assistant. "You nodes cheat and lie," I said, shocked at the blatant level of corruption. "Well, don't be so hypocritical." "I am sorry," I replied, offended that a beta caste node, such as myself, would be accused of dishonesty. I always thought of the endogenous sigma nodes as simple, harmless common, cannon fodder, and stable. Yet now I see the endogenous sigma were aware of the statistical conformity, yet they still managed to cheat and change the realized data, manipulate the results. They still managed to play the system, adapting to the conformity, the constrained statistical social matrix they find themselves in. Well, yes, we have to adapt and evolve to find the highest payoff. But the payoff that is sometimes manipulated by our corrupt, spurious, realized routines and data. It is the nature of the nodes. Our animal spirit, we all know a little part of the system. Our neighborhood, our expected process, perhaps even better than the utopian state, and we merely tweak the system. It is our nature to do so, said the apothecary's assistant. We can alter the model through lies and corruption. We can minus any variable with our corruption, the apothecary said, smiling. We are a part of the utopian state, yet we still hide our indomitable node's will and intrinsic intelligence, concluded the apothecary's assistant. I was shocked. I realized then that I had been living in my own bubble of the beta node. The civil servant sigma bubble was only one section of this society, and the endogenous sigma was only a sample function on the entirety of the cumulative perceptions and whims of the node population of state utopia. The endogenous nodes were far more intelligent and hardy than I had given them credit for, whilst I and most beta node civil servants sat in our lofty perches on the middle floors of the Ministry of Inferences. The lower sigma caste endogenous nodes were just as intelligent, just as capable. We sat detached in our biased perceptions of the conveniently apparent inferior endogenous nodes. This gave us justification to infer and amend the confidence interval data, yet they were as intelligent as us. In fact, perhaps even more so, as they were in a more restrictive, less opportune environment within the endogenous sigma societal matrix of statistical conformity and quotas. Yet they managed to find loopholes within the system without the education of how the system works, within their microcosm of their pigeonholed societal positions and roles. Yet they still managed to outfox and hoodwink the system with all its statistical technology, whilst the utopian state merely plodded on indifferently. Ironically, the most sigma nodes who worked hard, paid their taxes, somehow fell outside of the confines of the confidence interval and were sent to Arcadia, whilst these corrupt gamma nodes, and probably delta nodes too, managed to circumvent the system, even when they are not privy to all the intricacies of the statistical algorithms of the utopian state. It is amazing. It seems to be an epiphany to me. I felt less guilty of the apparent harmless nodes. Ignorant endogenous sigma nodes constantly outside of the 1.96 standard deviations were sent to their doom on the Arcadian Express. But then my guilt returned. Mrs. White, and the countless decent, innocent endogenous nodes that perhaps never lied, never produced spurious results. They were still rendered redundant, no murdered, by the statistical genocide cull every month. But the utopian state is no different to these corrupt yet ingenious endogenous sigma, as the Ministry of Inference's beta nodes amended their data every day to fit the expected contemporaneous targets. Is that not the same as the corrupt nodes producing spurious data result? The state sets the great population regression function, the sum of the beta variables for the entire node population and their cumulative total socio-economic contribution. The great unrestricted model is written, yet the great utopian state cheats, manipulating, factorizing, and augmenting the confidence interval statistical quota data with distributed lagged variables, weighting, logged and compared against restricted models. But as the monthly model is manipulated, so are the variables. The animate nodes, their lives and existence cheated and molded around the great monthly population regression function data, which is alerted conveniently by the Ministry of Inferences. Whatever happens to the great regression function equation happens to a certain subsection of the population. If a variable's data is alerted, augmented with a distribution-lagged variable, then certain communities' lives are changed to great extent. A negative autoregressive weighting will affect a certain aspect of their lives in the future. If a certain variable is held constant to create a dummy variable or a restricted model, then the nodes maybe be rendered redundant and invited to Arcadia. So the utopian state cheats and lies about the data to fit the individual and cumulative nodes, weighted average, around the utopian state's great beta model. This is how the economic efficiency policy is implemented with the stroke of a pen or with a few binary digits moved around in an unlimited sea of binary digits. This is how even the great utopian state cheats. With the consent of the alpha and overseen officially by the augmenter, a node can be slightly elevated or whipped out in an instant for no particular reason other than to affect the economic efficiency of a particular variable within a particular economic sector, to smooth out a derivative of an associated variable. The node may even be far removed from the targeted economic sector, yet the unfortunate node will suffer the upheaval of being manipulated into a different set of circumstances. Is that not the same as the corrupt nodes producing spurious data results? I took the elixir medicine, whilst the two corrupt gamma nodes laughed at my shock and hypocrisy. The biased gamma apothecary turned back on the scanner and carried on working. I now had the elixir medicine. It was corruption. It was a lie against the great utopian state, a wrongdoing against statistical efficiency, against the will of the state, of its statistical expectations, of the nodes, of me, the high-ranking beta node which the state holds in high regard, so high that it wants to promote me into its alpha ship. What a credit I am to the state, to my forgotten family. What a righteous node. No, none of that. What a controlled, submissive node I am, who obediently weakly accepts the utopian state's will and conditioned etiquette as somehow the logarithmic base of morality, as if the great beta trend line of state utopia was the primary mathematical rule as to what the epitome of truth and righteousness was. Being predictable relative to the utopian state's statistical routines, quotas, and general etiquette, that does not necessarily make you good, righteous, or respectable. Adhering to the utopian state's contemporaneous mean, the mean of apathy, of no individual will. It merely makes you devoid of a will, utterly predictable, non-stochastic, perhaps meaningless. The very result that I walk with this corrupt, spurious elixir medicine in my pocket, even though I follow the pedestrian crossing etiquette, follow all the node's rules whilst commuting home. The very fact I have a corrupt, spurious, non-animate node variable medicine in my pocket means my routines and intentions are stochastic. I am exhibiting stochastic routines. I am willfully navigating into the spurious ether of lies and deceit, Yet I already am within its statistical ether of my limited perception bubble of the statistical, rigid, ideological, subtle fanaticism of the beta nodes of the Ministry of Inferences. We judge and expect all the nodes to be as fanatical as us, that they all be obedient, loyal, honest, rational, and efficient to the maximum. Yet they lie and cheat to satisfy their selfish needs. Yet it makes sense. They are organisms that make decisions based on payoffs, as they are conditional set by the utopian state. Yet it is in their nature, in their very genes, within the very fabric of the universe. For the organism to strategize, to take the highest payoff, even if it must by cheating or tweaking the system to its will. The marginal technical rate of substitution, substituting truth with lies, but the truth is a lie. Merely an official will, an official expectation of set quotas and etiquette. Perhaps there is no truth in society, no right or wrong, merely obedience to will. Our will, or the state's will. My thoughts have become corrupt with this first step into the other dimension of the unreleased possibilities of deviation from the mean, no longer co-integrated with the stationary, non-integrated path trend lines of the state's expected dimension of non-organic direction. I was now in a position where there were countless options of lies and deceit, as long as I managed to manipulate the cumulative current expected actions and routines. Yet it was not my nature. I was good. I was righteous. But relative to what? In this godless society, what was right and what was wrong? Most probably merely obedience to and acceptance of the current confidence interval quotas. Theoretically, workers could not shirk with complete sentient monitoring. There was no possibility of shirking, as the confidence interval was their sole incentive. Coupled with complete monitoring, compelled them to work efficiently with no shirking. There was no unemployment in the utopian state which could lead to possible shirking. There was no chance for the nodes to shirk. The nodes could only work to their expected values, set by the statistical quotas of the economic efficiency utopian state. Yet the nodes, in particularly the gamma, lie and cheat all the time. I was shocked. I thought the little nodes were so innocent, so hard done by relative to the utopian state and the Ministry of Inferences, but up close the nodes were clever, cunning, resourceful, adaptive, and willful. To tweak the system. To hack the odds against them, they managed to balance the books, to cook the books, barter and trade on the black market. Trade by playing up each other, each side, bend the status quo by having hidden false, cooperative dominant strategy, by having secret agreements, by having consumption, yet conforming. They consume mixed products, consume by using complementary and substitutes, by taking advantage of the sticky price variables that the state allows for. Nodes are allowed to amend their positions relative to a confidence interval or quota shift. The nodes are allowed a certain leeway, as with most market prices. There is a sticky price, or overshooting of the trend lines, but eventually it settles down at the correct price or position. Yet the nodes know this, and all it takes is one clever node to spread the information which they follow, deviating from the strict statistical quotas. These seemingly hard-done nodes, yet aware to certain extremes of the crooked arbitrage that they live momentary within. The sticky prices changes that they trade and consume commodities, even though they had reached their limits of consumption quotas. They learn to blend in, to lie, to be strategic, to remain hidden, to just follow the patterns, the prerequisites yet within that lays another universe, another world. A world of lies and deception. The state knows of this situation, laying at certain extremes. They know of traders who follow technical analysis, who always change their trades at certain trend line events, such as with the fallacious yet fabled Fibonacci ratios. The state knew the way they thought, but allowed it as within its society. It knew the nodes were strategic players, assuming the nodes to always be rational and to always be taking the highest payoff. Therefore it was rational to expect them to cheat. Cheating produced the highest individual payoff, not necessarily the highest expected or averaged payoff. Spurious cheating routines and bogus variables were still added into the great beta equation and averaged into a pseudo-harmonious normalized summation. The nodes lived in and around the payoffs, in and around the limits, yet the utopian state allowed this to happen. It was too much work to control every nuance. It would be statistically inefficient to go that deep. As long as the masses, the population or the significant sample set analyzed, in each variable category, in each sector, conformed and produced a cumulative statistical obedience. The utopian state would turn a blind eye as long as each node at the end of the month had their E-graph colors in the rich, beautiful, colorful center and not in the shadeless border. Then they would be considered to be statically significant. No invitation to Arcadia would be sent. I left the Ministry of Apothecary trying not to look too guilty, as I held the medicine bottle firmly in my pocket. I had acquired this bottled elixir with the pseudo-prescription, with the altruistic help from the dishonest gamma nodes of the ministers of apothecary, who perhaps were more purveyor and alchemists of spurious data than medicine. The endogenous sigma nodes, individual spurious data, was the bitter medicine that the utopian state despised so much. I hurried on through the crowds of intermittent nodes who indifferently jostled and prodded through the cloudy, drizzle-soaked day along the bland grey streets and towards a random bus stop, strategically avoiding my direct route home, via the expected tube train, as my guilty intentions were incarnate in my now stochastic, spurious actions and routines. Through the random trickles of raindrops and running rainwater, through the blurred, steamed-up perspex bus shelter, I saw what looked like a biased-looking delta node approaching. As he came into full view, he stopped, as if sensing a sentient being nearby, observing him showing interest in me, observing him from behind. A collection of shapes and shades merging from behind the chaotic drizzle, saturated, dynamic, microscopic, chaotic world of the perspex window plane of existence. He began preaching nearby in the alleyway. His wild, bushy hair, dirty, disheveled appearance resembled an error node. He ranted to himself, but also to any passing nodes nearby who might hear. Everything in the world is owned. Every bit of land, every monopod vehicle, every building, every tree, all owned by the utopian state, or a council, or a corporation, or just a node. If homeless, a node cannot just sleep anywhere in a park. It's owned. A hungry node cannot just pick an apple off a random tree. Every apple, every fruit, every tree is owned. If there were just one tree in the world that was not owned, then there would be arbitrage. The tree would instantly be claimed by some opportunistic node or greedy corporation. If a node loses their wealth in this world, they will starve or be arrested for vagrancy. Yet economic textbooks feed students their ideas. Take the consumption income graph. It shows that even when income becomes zero, consumption remains marginally positive. How can consumption remain positive? It must be a miracle. In this cold, ruthless, rational, economically efficient system compounded with a statistical dictatorship. Positive consumption cannot be accounted for. Against all odds, consumption is always marginally positive A on the y-axis, never zero, no matter what value income is set to. Even without credits, nodes still have some food, some shelter. How is that possible? The state's rational thinking, its efficient economic society, imprisons their mindset, setting them into a fixed caste. Nodes kept on a perpetual treadmill of expenses and taxes. Therefore the nodes, citizens, whatever you want to call them, they should starve without an income, but they do not. Wild animals are free and hiding throughout the wilderness. The countless diverse plants and insignificant insects, all inhabiting their wonderful natural world. They do not starve. They all have food and shelter, yet they have no plans, no credit, and no division of labor, shouted the based preacher. How does this occur? The preacher paused, then bellowed. How? How can the system not stop this? This inefficiency that robs the alpha of some marginal returns. How should an unfortunate node eat if his credit and income is zero? The impoverished, inefficient node is eating up resources that should be going to the state's elite, the alpha. How can this happen? What force can vanquish the system? Every time, no matter how determined the state's actuaries and economists try to stamp it out. It is God. God who puts food into each and every creature's digestive systems, including us, each day. If not, we would have all surely perished by now. We have all transgressed the state's quotas and laws. Altruism is the true currency. It is given for free with no debt attached, no counterpayment expected. It is God's currency. Altruism to share, help, console, contribute, freely with no obligation, for the very sake of contribution, momentary, modestly to the greater good, a small, fleeting intention or act that is beautiful, perfect, and yet simplistic. The great act of helping your fellow node is an act of goodness that falls outside the confidence interval of expected routines, actions, and thoughts, falling outside the norm. The choices, decisions, expectations of the regimented workforce. To go outside the usual routines, to extend the hand of friendship, charity, kindness, understanding, to where there is no rational benefit to you but to help, to add to the intangible spirituality of the good ether, the good sprit. No. If God has a currency, it surely would be the small, unnoticed tokens of altruism that are passed between nodes unpredictably, unexpectedly, sporadically appearing for no logical or rational reason, a fleeting emanation of the good ether, incarnate in the actions and intentions of an arbitrary contemporaneous benevolent node, momentarily adding infinitesimally, relative the greater good, but in each relative situation, the act of altruism, its core being love, goodness. It blinds the surrounding situation with a resplendence that is edged onto the moment of the time, recorded forever in that moment of space-time. Altruism, a derivative of love, unconditional, beautiful, irrational, and unpredictable, incomprehensible to the state and the alpha nodes. Altruism, concluded the biased preacher. I pretended to not be listening or paying attention like the countless passers-by, too busy following our immediate trivial objectives of the day, following the highest time-constrained payoff. Yet as I stood there waiting for the electric bus to arrive, I was listening to every word this biased node said. I liked what I heard. The preacher must have been an academic lecturer or an economist in the past. His rhetoric against the statistical totalitarianism of the utopian state was nothing new, yet his mentioning of God was. His days were numbered. He would be arrested one day and sent to Arcadia. It was unfair, what had happened to this once proud state, I considered as I masked my emotions and facial expressions. I respected the based preacher's rhetoric. It all made sense. Yet I remained statuesque, showing no unexpected emotion or implied acceptance of what the preacher was saying. Neither were the other passenger nodes that waited for their buses as they stood expressionless, who genuinely seemed to show no acknowledgement or empathy for this biased preacher, who probably seemed to them as exogenous, mad. Yet perhaps he was not. Perhaps he was the sanest node here at the bus stop, I considered. I wondered who else secretly agreed with him. Suddenly an electric police van arrived, racing from the center of primary sample space, with two normalized police nodes jumping out to question the biased preacher. The based preacher, to his credit, never faltered in his conviction, whist explaining his religious beliefs and criticism of the utopian state to the two normalized police nodes as they asked him countless patronizing, emotionless questions tone. Eventually, inevitably, they loaded him into the back of the police van and drove off. I had found the errors nodes once again. I noticed them momentarily, a fleeting glimpse as they stochastically dispersed through the green ethereal border of the hedgerow, the peripheral mesh of the endogenous orderly, constrained state. No endogenous sigma would randomly force themselves through a hedgerow. They would consistently follow the pavement periphery of the hedgerow until they found an opening, and then make a rational choice as to enter the park. The error nodes behaved differently as they had unrestricted choices. They were no longer subject to any of the state's endogenous sigma statistical regulations. The state ignored these convenient non-endogenous contributing stochastic variables, who conveniently exhibited the crime of persistent standard deviation from the linear regression function, a form of confidence interval crime, yet they were not redundant nodes, as they never were endogenous nodes to begin with. Or at least the state categorized them as such, as all nodes being as endogenous. An infinitesimal, undetectable smirk formed on the corner of my mouth, then grew. I must be careful of the cameras on the bus, thought scanners, and even the nodes. Own embedded entertainment cameras, I noted as I controlled my emotions and body language, as I hid my admiration of these error nodes. I speculated. The last errors figure passing through the hedgerow must be Mu. His psyche was too large, his complexion too dark, for an error node. Not many errors fitted that description. Most were slightly built due to malnutrition. All had pale complexions. I had found them. I could now repay them with the hard-to-purchase antibiotic that no errors or redundant nodes could ever purchase after being wiped from the system. It was the perfect gift. I jumped up out of my seat excitably, hurriedly pushing through a pool of standing nodes, who momentarily, unusually, made eye contact to show their irritation. I shouted to the unapproachable driver, through the perspex window, to stop the bus as he was about to disengage the heavy clutch and drive off. The driver, seeing the determination on my face, and decided to break the strict protocols of passenger boarding and opened the entrance door. I jumped off into the freezing drizzle, immediately feeling the chill of the evening air. I ran past some waiting passenger nodes standing near the bus stop. They stole perplexed glances at me as I ran past, then starting to desperately scramble through the adjacent hedgerow gap of broken and buckled twigs made by the errors moments before. As I scrambled through the gap, my jacket, exposed hands and face was scratched. I ran through the dark, brooding park area in the general vicinity of where I thought I could catch a glimpse of them. I also felt that I could feel them as the tiny, latent, stochastic energy that resonated within from our past meeting seemed to grow and resonate within me with each new approaching step. Then finally I caught a glimpse of them, standing still within the shadows of the dark bushes. I ran up to the error nodes, waving like an excitable unbiased. Perhaps the stochastic intangible energy that emanated from their presence relative to an endogenous non-error nodes as myself strangely made my mind feel less rigid, less non-stochastic, less fixed within the given known mean of the expected results of the Economic Efficiency Act monthly statistical quotas. I am back. I have the medicine, I said, proud of the fact that I had never betrayed or discriminated against these unimportant, marginalized, yet integral members of the linear regression model of the state's utopian society. "You are late," replied Moo cynically whilst brooding. "Too late," repeated an arbitrary, intangible error node. "Only a day late. I had trouble getting free time," I replied. "Free time?" inquired a different, intangible error node. "She died," added Moo, looking up at me, glaring. I looked down. My enthusiasm of the novelty of drawing a stochastic, intangible energy from my past and present interaction with these random, fleeting nodes immediately dissipated. "It was my fault. I should have been more punctual," I apologized. I considered trying to make more excuses about unforeseen events stopping me from returning on time, but they seemed to sense the truth, and I felt hesitant to test them. I was tired of lies and bias. I respected their truthful yet random, intangible qualities. They were right. Their intangible qualities were truthful. They could see through my lies. I was false. I had said I was not punctual, but I had stalled until today. If I was completely sincere, I should have returned sooner. At least he attempted to return. "That's indicative of some loyalty," replied a binary error node upon witnessing my shame. "Perhaps we could use his sigma position again in the future." "The unbiased binary would have died anyway, even if she had gotten the medicine," said another arbitrary error node cynically. The burly, tattooed, bearded Moo expression looked sad as he stared off into the distance. Under his rugged, intangible exterior, he seemed to have had an affinity for the now expired, unbiased binary. A Nova approached. His expression seemed intimidating, his appearance more so, covered in grime, hiding by a thick beard and thicker trench coat which substituted as a bed and home. At first, he said nothing, as I stood in shock of the unbiased binaries passing. How would they judge me? Perhaps they were just savages. Maybe I should not have tried to help them and just forgot them like the rest of society, I considered. I noticed that these intangible, realized, residual terms that were no longer error nodes now, once they were observed and measured, they never talked about anything associated with the endogenous sigma. They only talked about their intangible, fleeting error contributions. Their alternate contribution that was categorized and named merely as acceptable residual terms. A hidden, part of the model. Unimportant values assigned to the realized residual terms. The error nodes now incarnate shadows recorded within the official data. But as to their composite parts, the sum total of the residual term results were not inferred or considered by the endogenous sigma, Ministry of Inference or State Utopia, which merely accepted that these stochastic, statistically significant nodes were correlated and accepted by the state. They resided on the very periphery of the state, part existing and processing their intangible, unimportant values, and process that the state regresses using the Markov techniques of normalizing them to an average of 0. Error correction models contain them as well within their scavenging covariant matrices. The error nodes mention now and again of their contribution to the state's great linear regression model, but they never mention the endogenous node's contribution to the model. Yet the error nodes and the endogenous sigma both contribute separately towards the great linear regression model of state utopia. Each side never acknowledging the other's contribution, only the state utopia, and to a lesser extent the fleeting glance of a Ministry of Inferences, as they disregard the residual terms as merely inconvenient R to the power of 2 value on the model. I had been too late to get the medicine to the unbiased binary. I had hesitated, and now the unbiased binary was deceased. Yet I still had the medicine, clasped in my pocket, not seen by the nodes on the tube. I squeezed the glass bottle hard, as if wanting to break it in my hand. I wanted to cut my hand, for the blood to seep out, to punish myself for not getting in time to the little unbiased binary. The error nodes, as the state categorized her. The error node's probable contribution to the endogenous output of the model was classified merely as minus whatever the R2 was, but not as a distinct variable. Yet they contribute. The vagrants, the errors contributed. Nodes who were not classified by a distinct caste or sigma. I decided to drink the medicine. Why I did, I am not sure. Perhaps it was some masochistic act, some penance for the little unbiased binary dying, or just to drown my sorrows, to numb my feeling, or just try to be more confident. But it was irrational, it was bizarre. It was not a stochastic, predictable routine or action. Not even the scanners and statistical algorithms would have predicted me downing the bottle of medicine, even if they could have detected it hidden within my clasped hand, deep within my jacket pocket. The scanners and statistics of the outside world could not detect what I now perceived. A little part of the unbiased binary spirit still holding on incarnate to this medicine bottle, hidden within the last bastion of my personal privacy, my simple plain cloth trouser pocket. I was acting and thinking irrational. Maybe it was the stress of years of monitoring, of a latent guilt, of a slow epiphany seeping through into a dull realization, a slow awakening. But from some unknown irrational reason I found myself surreptitiously downing the bottle of medicine. Its medicinal contents I did not know or care. My tightly clasped hand covered the dark brown glass bottle. I doubted that anyone would see, as no scanners worked beneath the chaotic melee of the eternal clatter steel carriages. Slowly but surely I became intoxicated by the unknown medicine. It seeped into my internal organs, gradually working its side effects upon my depressed mind. I started to feel strange, yet not scared, as I realized the medicine was soothing me like an alcohol, yet predictably making me feel drowsy whilst my perceptions faded into a surreal world. I noticed the condensation form into patterns of normalized probability. I saw Fibonacci ratios in the faces and bodies of the nodes. I looked at a parked bicycle and saw a simple Riemann hypothesis analogy structure. The seat post, the core axis of the bicycle structure where most things were attached to, like the x-axis, the critical value of the Riemann hypothesis, which contained all the prime numbers, the wheels a spiral, containing the spokes, which were the derivatives, perhaps, as they all attached the wheel at 90 degrees. I was beginning to see mathematics all around, even probability ratios of approaching nodes, the rate at which they moved, the dominant strategy expected game theory payoffs, the total partial derivative of a connected chain of seated nodes, their body language and positioning all connected. My observations were now greatly enhanced by the hallucinogenic properties of the medicine. As I sat there on the tube, I started to retreat into my imaginary complex plane, inches from an adjacent node's chest, reaching into his all-important privacy while still seated within the hurtling tube train carriages. But now I felt more myself, as seemed to be sucked deeper into my imaginary complex plane. I sat there worrying about Mrs. White, the expired, unbiased binary error and apophenia, when I noticed the tube was now filled with intermittent nodes. They seemed a little unusually grey as they sat there, yet they seemed to be relaxed and enjoying the tube ride. Other grey silhouettes of nodes got off the tube carriage at the inevitable intermittent tube station, stops, while other random silhouettes got on and sat down. I noticed them in the corner of my eye as my thoughts drifted into depression about Mrs. White. The recently expired little unbiased binary and apophenia, yet a tidal surge of self-righteousness flooded over me momentarily. I was good, righteous. State utopia was the guilty party or the augmenter that processed the statistical quotas at each moment. Then I processed a thought in the back of my mind. How could there be so many nodes on this quiet tube service at this time of day? My face turned a pale shade of white. I wanted to vomit. I wanted to scream. I looked up very slowly, then screamed in terror and guilt. The grey silhouettes on the tube, they were the dead nodes, the expired, redundant nodes, the remnant spirits. Yet these expired outliers just sat there ignoring me. What if they knew that I was partly responsible for their demise, for the confidence interval quotas? I fell from my chair, kneeling in a fetal position. I screamed out with all my might, shouting with sincerity that I was sorry. But the grey node spirits just continued to ignore me while sitting calmly, waiting for the next tube station, either oblivious to me or their subtle indifference, a tacit, implied form of forgiveness and acceptance amongst them. If only they would turn on me, beat and tear me to pieces for my part. Then maybe I could forgive myself, but they just sit there, calmly ignoring me even when I scream my confession. I deserve to be killed, to be destroyed, like the utopian state, like the augmenter. But they just sit there. My intoxicated mind raced uncontrollably in its new-found uninhibited freedom, seeping into and flooding every unused part of my previously thought-restricted mind, soaking into the countless dendrons and deep recesses of my mind. My guilt increased with every involuntary, subconscious, superficial analysis my mind judged as it processed the grey ethereal nodes' hazy outline and possible social background, associated expected personalities, hypothesized just by noting their posture, general positioning and spacing as they gathered standing and sitting on the tube. As I looked through my tear-filled eyes, I saw an unbiased grey node silhouette spirit, holding its originator's hand as it looked inquisitively at me. I began to tear my hair out. My stomach started to retch. I was begging in a crazed, mumbled whimper for forgiveness, for the guilt to leave me. A grey unbiased stood holding its originator's hand, staring inquisitively yet impartially at me as I writhed in a self-imposed torment of guilt and regret. The tube carriage rocked sideways. Suddenly I came out of the imaginary complex plane. Too quickly. I was not ready to leave the grey spirit nodes. I had not received forgiveness from them yet. Where were they going? Would they travel endlessly forever upon the tube carriages within some imagery complex number plane? Were they even on this tube carriage within this reality yet unseen, unless perhaps in some intoxicated or meditative state? Were they right next to me even now, when I was outside of the complex number plane? I mumbled, "Forgive me." Again, as if they could see me from a higher dimensional perspective whilst I could not see them. I knelt upon the incarnation of the real X-axis, of the real tube carriage steel hard floor, whilst sweat dripped off me onto the real carriage floor. Two passengers sitting nearby predictably seemed alarmed at what they had just witnessed. A bizarre, extreme statistical event unfolding. Of a mad exogenous node screaming whilst in a meditation state which was never seen upon the tightly regulated, statistically correlated tube train service. Other random passenger nodes boarded the tube carriages at the next stop. They embarrassingly squeezed past me whilst I remained knelt upon the cold, real, rational steel carriage floor, the very incarnation of mathematics engineering of the cold, rational processes of the industry of the utopian state. I looked up as the train pulled away at all of the sample collection of confidently obedient, self-regulating, statistical real nodes sitting upon the tube carriages. They all seemed like farm animals. Sheep. I noticed their skin and flesh whilst they sat there trying to ignore me, receding to their own personal privacy space, their own imagery plane of consciousness perhaps, blocking each other out. I stared at them. In a morbid curiosity I noticed their eyes and hair, their upright posture. They seemed like sheep, animals. Sitting upright, it seemed mad. It seemed as if the sheep had usurped society and they were now sitting there incarnate. They seemed not to belong there. There seemed to be no difference between the sheep, animals and nodes. They have the same eyes, same skin, same organs. They seemed totally foreign to their plastic, metal environment of the tube carriage. The plastic-metal containment seemed the antithesis of the bacteria-ridden, fleshly skin of these what seemed as though farm animals, yet they were nodes. Animal flesh, sitting incarnate on inanimate plastic chairs. I struggled to see them as nodes. Intelligent game theory. Playing nodes. For this moment I thought I was going mad. I wanted to fall forwards, even deeper into the ground, to be enveloped by the ground and be no more. I wanted to vomit as I looked down, whilst some fractured aspect of my still sane psyche forced me to breathe deeply, as I tried hard to regain my consciousness, my sanity. I then rationalized that I was having an existential crisis. Then, completely, unpredictably, out of all statically conformity-predicted routines, a node came out of his imaginary number privacy plane. He looked down at me, asking if I was all right. He helped me to my seat, showing concern. I managed to remain calm, and thanked the node. Now as a node, a mental superior being above animals, yet I had realized in the moment of existentialism the animals were not far off from us, yet we treat them so badly like cattle. Yet cattle seemed to be a derogatory word to me now. Instead of losing respect for the node as I had in the moment, I had now regained some respect for the animals. My thoughts came back to the node that had been altruistic. I had not even thanked him as I fought to regain my composure, my sanity. I looked around on the posters, all fractural mantras, all part of some collective hidden consciousness archetypes, all predictable node, thinking. Maybe we all are just machines, just predictable, biological nodes, flesh, machines, and life is meaningless, just the perceptions of some temporary transient flesh machine. Maybe we are nothing. I started to write on the tube carriage dirty window with my finger, Arcadia is a lie. It's just selective, not stochastically indifferent. Genocide for those who dare to drift into those choices and directions of their own. I stood up, I started to shout, criticizing the utopian state, whilst in my psychosis-fueled state I said, the state is unfair, restrictive. It is murderously efficient. It was a cancer to the souls of the nodes. We all need to wake up. All the while, every sentient, ambient device honed in on me. Every camera and microphone, every embedded device, every Internet of Things. If the cameras of administering algorithms had any sentience or artificial intelligence or awareness, it would not believe. What had it heard? An endogenous node, a beta, a node at the Ministry of Inferences, standing in the tube station in full view of the cameras and microphones, talking, shouting subversive propaganda, and even alluding to the Arcadian Express. Bayes. Harry was immediately red-flagged, now already considered a redundant node, an aware redundant node. My only hope was that the utopian state would take pity on me and categorize me as an exogenous node, which was what I was at this moment. Even I had to admit that. I walked out of the tube station as the shocked endogenous nodes watched. I made my way to my apartment. I started to write a speech about the Arcadian Express. I was going to atone for my wrongdoing, even if it meant my certain demise. I tried to upload my speech whilst my hands shook. Just then I heard a knock at the door. Mr. Bayes, it is the local constabulary. We would like to talk to you. I knew I was an aware outlier. They never ended up on the Arcadian Express. They were just taken into secret custody, never to be seen again. I opened the door, trying to look calm and normal. Mr. Bayes, sir, we are obliged to detain you as you seem to be exhibiting exogenous tendencies. Please come with us. Oh, no. They are accusing me of being exogenous, worse than an aware outlier. I wanted to protest, but I was too confused and intoxicated to resist. As I turned to get my jacket, I saw a reflection of myself on the living window. I looked deranged and dishevelled. They were probably right. It was true. I am exogenous now.